and welcome to Tucker Carlson Tonight. America's longest war ended today. After nearly 20 years, the final U.S. military aircraft lifted off from Afghanistan. General Kenneth McKenzie of the United States Marine Corps oversaw this war. Here was his announcement.
I'm here to announce the completion of our withdrawal from Afghanistan and the end of the military mission to evacuate American citizens, third country nationals, and vulnerable Afghans. The last C-17 lifted off from Hamid Karzai International Airport on August 30th, this afternoon, at 3:29 p.m. East Coast time. And the last manned aircraft is now clearing the airspace above Afghanistan.
So we got everyone out, and we're done. It's a poignant moment. More than 4,000 Americans overall died in Afghanistan over 2 decades, including last week several enlisted Marines who were just infants when American troops first arrived in that country. So finally, after decades, it is done. But is it done? Just moments after the clip you just saw, after announcing that we had left Afghanistan for good, General McKenzie conceded that actually not all of us did leave. In fact, there are still Americans trapped in Afghanistan. The United States military left them behind. Watch.
No American citizens came out on the last, what we call the joint tactical exfiltration, the last 5 jets to leave. We maintained the ability to bring them in up until immediately before departure, but we were not able to bring any Americans out. That activity ended probably about 12 hours before our exit, although we continued the outreach and would have been prepared to bring them on until the very last minute, but none of them made it to the airport and were able to be accommodated.
None of them made it to the airport. So that answers a lot of questions. In the past week, you may have wondered about this large but unknown number of American citizens you keep reading about who, for whatever reason, are still stuck in Afghanistan. And you may have asked yourself, who are these people and why are they still there? Maybe they don't want to leave. That may be the conclusion you've come to. Maybe we don't owe them anything. It would be nice to believe that, very nice, but now we can't believe it because we've just learned from the commander of American troops in the region that at least some of these people who are our countrymen, our fellow Americans, really are trapped in a nation controlled by the Taliban. These Americans tried to flee, but it was too chaotic and too dangerous. As General McKenzie just put it, they couldn't get to the airport in time, so the U.S. military just left. Tough. Call us if you make it to Tampa. It's hard to believe that General McKenzie just admitted this in public. The reporters in the briefing room seemed to think it was just perfectly normal, another Pentagon briefing. But there's nothing normal about this, not in this country. It is appalling on every level. It is the definition of dishonorable. What's the point of having a military that doesn't bother to rescue its own citizens? This is a serious question. Why do we have an army? All those guns and helicopters and missile systems? Isn't the whole point of all of it, its whole purpose, is to protect Americans? Apparently there's another purpose, at least in the view of the man who oversees the military's central command. Those trapped Americans are no longer our problem, General McKenzie explained. We're going to let the State Department deal with them. And with that, tanned and relaxed from his extended vacation in the Hamptons, garage band enthusiast and part-time Secretary of State Tony Blinken took the podium. Yes, Blinken confirmed there are more than 100 Americans who've been abandoned in Afghanistan and who are understandably desperate to get out. No, we have no actual way to guarantee their safe passage. The military's gone, but no problem. The medieval theocracy that now runs Afghanistan has everything under control. The Taliban have given us their word that American citizens will be fine. And with that, Tony Blinken left the stage. He took no questions. Nor, by the way, did Joe Biden appear then or at any other time today to explain what exactly is happening to these Americans or in Afghanistan. The President of the United States appears to be missing again. If you take 3 steps back, you can see very clearly that we're watching some kind of pivot point in our history. The most obvious casualty, apart from the 13 dead servicemen last week, is American power and prestige, both of which, in the span of just days, have been profoundly and permanently diminished. There will be huge consequences of this moment. You'll see them both in the near term, you'll see them through the generations going forward. But for now, it's worth answering a simple question. Who is taking responsibility for this? Who's paying for the disaster we're watching? Not so long ago, that would have been an easy question to answer. Our leaders would be paying the price. Until fairly recently, the people in charge understood that leadership comes with obligations. It's not all privileges. If you're going to make big decisions, you have to be willing to suffer if they go wrong. In the spring of 1912, Edward Smith ran his ship into an iceberg in the North Atlantic. As it went down, Smith did not blame climate change for the disaster. Instead, he stood stoically in the wheelhouse and rowed the Titanic to the bottom of the ocean, and people applauded. It didn't seem strange. It was expected. He was in charge. He stayed until the end. So who's in charge of this? And more to the point, who is paying for it? Well, over time, an entire class of foreign policy experts and political leaders are responsible. They watched for 20 years as Afghanistan turned into a pointless mess in which Americans died and were damaged beyond repair. And as this happened, they said nothing. In fact, they lied about it repeatedly. Who are these people? The name Liz Cheney comes to mind, but there are many, many like her. And then there are the people responsible for what has happened in the last couple of weeks, a pullout that could not have been more ineptly managed if you'd intended to screw it up. That would be Joe Biden and his many incompetent lieutenants, some of whom seem deranged. So what is their punishment? How many of them have been fired? How many have resigned? How many have even apologized? That's the best place to start always. To our knowledge, none. Not one. In fact, so far as we can tell, the only military leader to suffer so far for this disaster is a Marine Corps Lieutenant Colonel called Stu Scheller. Now, Scheller didn't decide to abandon Bagram Air Base. The blood of those 13 servicemen last week are not in his hands. Scheller's crime was posting this video on social media.
If an 05 battalion commander has the simplest live fire incident EO complaint, boom, fired. But we have a Secretary of Defense that testified to Congress in May that the Afghan National Security Force could withstand the Taliban advance. We have chairmen of Joint Chief, who the Commandant is a member of that, who's supposed to advise on military policy. We have a Marine combatant commander. All of these people are supposed to advise. And I'm not saying we've got to be in Afghanistan forever, but I am saying, did any of you throw your rank on the table and say, hey, it's a bad idea to evacuate Bagram Airfield, the strategic air base, before we evacuate everyone?
So this is a disaster. That is obvious. The disaster is the result of a series of bad decisions made by people whose names we know. Have any of those people been punished, explained themselves, or apologized? That's the question that Stu Scheller asked. And for asking it, the Pentagon relieved him of his command. On Sunday, Stu Scheller announced that he was resigning from the Marine Corps. He's got 3 years until retirement and the pension that comes with it. But he's leaving. Here's why.
All I asked for was accountability of my senior leaders when there are clear, obvious mistakes that were made. I'm not saying we can take back what has been done. All I asked for was accountability, for people to comment on what I said and to say, yes, mistakes were made. I think them accepting accountability would do more for service members and PTSD and struggling with purpose than any other transparent piece of paper or message. And I haven't received that.
Yeah. I mean, thousands of Americans died in Afghanistan. Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands were permanently damaged by the time they spent there, over 20 years. And the exit diminishes our country permanently. Who did that, and why haven't they apologized? It's a really simple question, and for asking it, Scheller was relieved of command. Instead of taking any form of responsibility for this disaster that they caused, the Biden administration, bewilderingly, is doing the opposite. They are bragging in public with a straight face about what a great job they've done. Joe Biden's Flack already announced that the White House does not plan to punish anyone. That means at the Pentagon or at the intel agencies for what we're watching now. No one.
Does he believe he was given bad advice? And will he ask for any resignations of his generals, given the high cost of American and Afghan lives?
No to both of those questions.
So the Biden administration's position has not changed in the face of all the evidence we're watching on television. They're telling you they did as well as they possibly could have done. Joe Biden first said that on August 19th. That was prior to the bombing in Kabul. But as recently as today, the Pentagon's top spokesman said it again. Watch the oily John Kirby explain that there was no possible way to predict that, for example, Afghanistan's president, Ashraf Ghani, would suddenly abandon the country to the Taliban.
Our expectation was that the Ghani government would stay in place. Nobody could have imagined how quickly that government would have literally just dissipated almost overnight. There was simply no way to predict that.
So we could spend the rest of the show, the rest of the week, the rest of the year till New Year's Day forensically going through each lie that they're telling you and batting it down because these are the flimsiest possible lies. We're not going to do that. It would give everyone a headache. But let's just take a close look at this one. Quote, there was simply no way to predict that the president of Afghanistan was going to fold and run away. So if you want a sense of how ludicrous that statement is, what a lie it is, consider what our government knew about Ashraf Ghani, the president of Afghanistan. According to the Washington Post, the Pentagon didn't even know that Ghani had fled Afghanistan until they saw it on television. They had no idea. Quote, U.S. officials were as surprised as anyone. The Americans had expected Ghani would stay for an orderly transition to an interim authority, but he did not inform most of the government's senior ranks, including his two vice presidents, about his departure. Nor did Ghani contact the U.S. government, which was left to piece together the absent leader's movement from rumor and media reports. So our intel agencies received a combined $85 billion last year alone in federal tax dollars. For perspective, that's more money than Russia, Germany, and the UK spend on their entire annual military budgets. But for all that money, our generals and our spies were confident that Ashraf Ghani would stick around for a, quote, orderly transition. They say there was no way to predict otherwise. Meanwhile, no one, not the Pentagon, not the CIA, not the State Department, could say where Ashraf Ghani was. They had no idea. So our authorities have no problem finding, say, a middle-aged woman who committed the crime of waving a flag at the Capitol building on January 6th, but they have no idea how to find the president of Afghanistan. Now, that's not to say we were completely in the dark. What our leaders did notice is that before Kabul fell, it was evident that Ghani did not care at all about doing his job and was not capable of doing it. This is the guy that we installed effectively, whatever they tell you. As the Taliban began seizing key territories all over the country, provincial capitals, all through the summer, Ghani was transfixed not by what was happening in Afghanistan, but by a new government salary payment system that was slated to roll out soon. According to the Post's account, quote, even as a cascade of provincial capitals fell, President Ghani appeared distracted. According to one official who spoke to the Post, quote, Ghani would want to talk about the digitization of the economy. It had nothing to do with the dire threat, end quote. Keep in mind, Ghani, no background in any relevant discipline. The guy was a college professor who worked at Johns Hopkins. We picked some completely incompetent tool from American academia rather than like an actual Afghan who could run the country. Of course we did, because Tony Blinken liked him, and people like Tony Blinken liked him. So the president of Afghanistan's flaky personal behavior reportedly raised some red flags with U.S. officials. That would include Frank McKenzie, the head of Central Command. The Post reports that McKenzie was, quote, mystified by Ghani's behavior. The question is, did anyone in the Pentagon do anything about it? Well, of course they didn't. Nothing. They just pretended everything was fine because they're dumb. As the Taliban swept through Afghanistan, the State Department wasn't reaching out to Ghani to figure out where he was or what he was doing. Instead, Tony Blinken and his deputies were working to get other countries to sign a statement to send to the Taliban, urging them to let Americans out of the country. Ultimately, that statement was signed by military powerhouses like Haiti, Papua New Guinea, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. That's what the Secretary of State thinks is significant. Getting Papua New Guinea and Congo and Haiti to sign some stupid document that means nothing? These are children. But no one's apologizing for it. They won't even acknowledge they screwed up. They're not having a moment of self-reflection about why were they on the phone with the government of Haiti as American citizens were trapped in Afghanistan run by our new friends, the Taliban. They're never going to explain why they did this, why they put the safety of thousands of American citizens in the hands of a president who didn't care enough to stick around. And of course, that president, Ghani, isn't apologizing either. He was trained by the U.S. after all. He was educated at Columbia. And he's taken millions of dollars we've given him and we've fled, all while claiming to be a hero who left his country to avoid more bloodshed rather than what he clearly is, which is a coward. Meanwhile, his kids, they're Americans, of course. They've got U.S. passports. They're living in million-dollar properties in Washington, D.C. and Brooklyn and demanding that this country accept as many Afghan refugees as possible. His son, by the way, worked for Pete Buttigieg on the presidential campaign. That tells you everything. So to choose a president of Afghanistan, our brain-dead ruling class chose someone just like them. Of course they did. Suddenly, a lot of what we've seen over the past 20 years in Afghanistan, in particular over the past 4 months, makes sense. The experts in the State Department and the CIA took trillions of dollars to install people in Afghanistan who are every bit as clueless as they are. Remember, it was in June that U.S. intelligence was predicting that the Ghani government would remain intact for 6 months. As recently as this month, Mark Milley said he had no intelligence suggesting the Taliban would take over Afghanistan quickly.
There was nothing that I or anyone else saw that indicated a collapse of this army and this government in 11 days.
So they believed that. They actually believed it because the incompetents around him kept repeating it like it was true, and they bought it. And that's one of the reasons the Pentagon abandoned Bagram Air Base, which would have been, of course, a much easier place to secure than an airport, a commercial airport in the capital city. They didn't think they'd need Bagram. They had confidence in Ashraf Ghani, the guy who was obsessing over Afghans' new version of PayPal. That's also why the Biden administration reportedly turned down the Taliban's offer to cede all of Kabul to the U.S. military. They thought they'd have far more time than they actually did.
On the tactical decision of which is the right airport to have for an evacuation, of course, any responsible president would give significant weight to the advice of the commanders on the ground, and their advice was to close Bagram and focus on Kabul.
Oh, close Bagram and focus on Kabul. We did that, and now a lot of people are dead, and a lot are still stuck there. And once again, to beat a dead horse, no one has apologized. If you caught one of your kids doing something wrong, you wouldn't rest until that child apologized. Contrition is an essential part of fixing a problem. It's not just practically important, it's spiritually important. Admit you were wrong, and they won't, because they don't care what you think. And so to this moment, the only person who has been punished for these terrible decisions, one Marine Corps officer who criticized those decisions. This can't go on. When leaders refuse to hold themselves accountable, over time, people revolt. That happens. We need to change course immediately and start acknowledging our mistakes. The people who made them need to start acknowledging them, or else the consequences will be awful.
Hey, Sean Hannity here. Hey, click here to subscribe to Fox News YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.